Sometimes presidential candidates can run the best campaign possible, but the political environment is just too much to overcome. In fact, US elections are by and large decided by how happy or unhappy people are with the job being done by the party controlling the White House at the time. And while some campaigns can make up for that if the divide is close, many times the feeling is so unanimous that nobody from one of the parties would win an election that year. But which candidates did everything they could to win and still failed because of such a tough environment? Welcome into the History Buffs Hub. In this video, we're going to break down the 5 best campaigns by candidates who lost the presidential election. Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button down below, and also ring the bell and turn on your notifications. Leave a comment too. Give your opinions. History Buffs Hub wants to cover anything history related, from politics to sports to pop culture, but we can't do it without your help. For this list, we're only looking at major party candidates who were among the top 2 vote getters in any election. It won't exclude all upstart parties, as you'll see, but they have to have been one of the 2 primary parties in that election. Ross Perot's run in 1992 doesn't count. Now let's dive in. Number 5, Hubert Humphrey, 1968. With the Democratic Party coalition coming apart at the seams, Hubert Humphrey had an impossible task in the 1968 presidential election. As vice president to the wildly unpopular Lyndon B. Johnson, whose approval rating was in the mid-30s throughout the year largely due to the Vietnam War, Humphrey should have been blown out. Richard Nixon ran against him in his political comeback after losing the 1960 presidential election to John F. Kennedy and then the 1962 California gubernatorial election to Pat Brown. As we mentioned in our video of the best overall presidential campaigns ever, linked down below, Nixon applied the immoral but wildly effective Southern strategy in this one, which allowed him to win over many Southern whites and Southern states that would have otherwise gone to segregationist George Wallace. But that was only necessary because Humphrey was running such a good campaign. Think about what Humphrey was dealing with. There was Vietnam, the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., and the riots at the 1968 Democratic Convention. Crime and inflation were up, and after LBJ lost the Democrats their key Southern white bloc by supporting civil rights legislation, he lost them the black vote too, with the FBI's open hostility to several black protest groups and notable black individuals, most prominently Muhammad Ali, for refusing the Vietnam draft. Despite all this, Humphrey only lost the popular vote by 0.6 percentage points and 301 to 191 in the Electoral College. He was 100,000 votes in 3 states away from preventing Nixon from reaching the necessary 270 Electoral College votes and creating a contingent election and sending the race back to Congress, which was controlled by Democrats. So how did he keep it so close? Well, we know Wallace helped take more votes from Nixon than him in the Deep South per retroactive analysis, but Humphrey did the opposite of what Kamala Harris did in 2024. He openly broke from the president he was serving under. In his September 30th speech, Humphrey said he would stop the bombing of North Vietnam as an acceptable risk for peace and proposed an immediate ceasefire. This break from Johnson resulted in Humphrey closing a 15-point gap to Nixon down to just 5 points midway through October. He then relentlessly went on the offense economically, selling LBJ's Great Society programs and what it had done for working people, and that message was enough to bring home a lot of white voters who were toying with Wallace's campaign. By November, the election had become a toss-up. Nixon still pulled it out, but the fact that Humphrey was ever within striking distance was a shocker. Number 4, William Jennings Bryan, 1896. Known as a perpetual general election loser 100 years later, William Jennings Bryan ran for president as the Democratic nominee in 1896, 1900, and 1908, and lost all 3 times. He represented the populist wing of the party, which tried and often failed to wrestle control away from him. Unfortunately for Bryan, none of these elections were good environments for Democrats, but 1896 was the worst environment, and his best campaign. During that run, incumbent Democratic President Grover Cleveland was wildly unpopular due to the ongoing effects of the Panic of 1893 and the fact that he had completely ripped apart his coalition by using federal troops to break up several union strikes. He completely lost the wing of the party that was pro-labor and for free silver while siding with the sound money wing. It was an impossible coalition to keep together anyway, so when Republican William McKinley ran for president in 1896, he really didn't have to do anything but oppose the Cleveland administration. That alone was enough for him to usher in the 4th party system with his win. But it should have been a landslide, and McKinley only won the popular vote by 5 percentage points in the Electoral College, 271 to 176. Bryan was just 25,000 votes in 6 states away from winning the Electoral College. That's because Bryan actually managed to build a new Democratic coalition that could have been a threat. Bryan broke with Cleveland and fully embraced the populist wing of the Democratic Party, running on free silver, labor rights, and a progressive platform that called for the regulation of big business. This was the darkest period of the Gilded Age, which was drawing to a close, and Bryan mainstreamed the idea of attacking wealth inequality. You can honestly trace the roots of modern liberalism to Bryan's firebrand campaign. This coalition pushed the sound money voters, who agreed with Cleveland's decision to move back to the gold standard, over to McKinley, but Bryan made up for it by consolidating the populist who had run a third-party candidate in 1892 into his platform. As far as campaign strategy, Bryan invented the whistle-stop tour strategy, where he would use the train to barnstorm the country with his messaging, taking it to every place he could. The whole concept of going all over the country to campaign was pioneered by Bryan. Then there was Bryan's own charisma. He was an elite orator and knew how to inspire people emotionally to support him. The result was Bryan actually getting 1 million more votes than Cleveland did in 1892, turning out vast swaths of new voters. McKinley's consolidation of sound money voters and traditional Republicans alone wouldn't have been enough, but unfortunately for Bryan, when it came to swing voters, he couldn't overcome the fact that he was a Democrat, and a Democrat was in the White House while the worst economic crash in world history to that point was raging. 4 years later, Bryan tried the same strategy, but the strong economy and success in the Spanish-American War were too much to overcome, so McKinley won again. Still, Bryan's presence and campaign style was such a force that Republicans in the fourth party system adopted many of his policies under Teddy Roosevelt after McKinley's assassination to bring the populists into their tent, and that ushered in the progressive era in the 1900s, so while Bryan lost the elections, he won on policy. Number 3. John C. Frémont, 1856. If there was ever such thing as a moral victory for a party in a presidential election, John C. Frémont's loss in 1856 might be it. The central issue of the campaign was the debate over the expansion of slavery due to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Democratic President Franklin Pierce signed into law the creation of the territories of Kansas and Nebraska in 1854 and gave the residents of those states the autonomy to decide whether or not they wanted to be slave or free, a direct violation of the 1820 Missouri Compromise, which dictated where slavery could and could not exist in the U.S. This led to Bleeding Kansas, where pro- and anti-slavery groups violently clashed, trying to stuff the ballot boxes in those territories, and it was also the final blow to the Whig Party, which was a loose coalition formed just out of opposition to Jacksonian Democrats 20 years earlier. The dissolution of the Whigs led to two parties competing to become the main opposition party to the Democrats. One was the Know Nothing Party, a nativist party radically opposed to immigration, particularly from Catholics. They nominated former Whig President Millard Fillmore in 1856, who also doused gasoline on the fiery slave debate when he was in the White House by signing the Compromise of 1850 enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. The other party was the newly formed Republican Party, which was founded on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery. This party included abolitionists, which was a fringe radical group just a decade earlier, and it was by far more anti-slavery than was even deemed possible for a major American party at this time. They nominated Frémont to run in 1856. The Democrats nominated James Buchanan, whose position was that individual states and territories should decide for themselves whether or not they want to be slave or free. Because of the split on the other side, he won 45.3% of the popular vote, 12 points more than either of the other two candidates, and 174 electoral votes when only 149 were needed to win. On paper, that was a decisive victory for Buchanan, but Frémont's campaign style set the stage for eventual Republican Party dominance. While Buchanan stayed out of the fray, Frémont came up with the brilliant slogan "Free Soil, Free Men, Frémont." And as a former explorer who served as a military officer in the Mexican-American War, he presented himself as uniquely qualified to oppose the expansion of slavery in the new territories. The country wasn't abolitionist at the time, so Frémont framed the debate as slave-owning states trying to force their way of life on anti-slavery states, most notably with the Fugitive Slave Act, that forced free states to recognize slaves of families vacationing in those states. He also highlighted the amount of outsized power slave states seemed to wield in Congress relative to their populations, and the way they were trying to force new territories to be slave territories. Frémont used the term slave power regularly in his campaign and successfully built up a major level of resentment against the slave owners and slave states. The result was Frémont shockingly winning 11 states and 114 electoral votes, significantly better than Fillmore, who won just one state. As a result, despite being an upstart third party, the Republicans were able to consolidate those opposed to the Jacksonian Democrats. 2 years later, they were able to take the House of Representatives, and 4 years later, it led to the election of Abraham Lincoln, beginning a streak of 6 straight Republican presidential election victories, all from a party that didn't even exist 6 years before its first presidential win. None of that happens without Frémont laying the groundwork in 1856. Number 2, Andrew Jackson, 1824. Again, if you watch our video on the best campaigns in US history, you'll see Andrew Jackson's 1828 run on there. Everything that made that campaign successful also applied to his 1824 run, so we actually don't need to repeat any of it. In short, Jackson invented modern campaigning by selling his personality, which was considered unbecoming of candidates beforehand, and he embraced the growing populist movement with white non-landowners increasingly coming into the political fold. The only difference between 1828 and 1824 is Jackson lost in 1824, because he was cheated. In a four-way race, Jackson won the popular vote by a plurality, capturing 40.5%. He won 99 electoral votes, again a plurality. His closest challenger was John Quincy Adams, who won 32.7% of the popular vote and 84 electoral votes. William H. Crawford captured 11% of the popular vote and 41 electoral votes, and with the election inevitably going back to Congress since nobody received the necessary electoral votes to win, Crawford's plan was to hold out and force a vote for him. However, enter Henry Clay, the fourth person in the race, who won 13% of the popular vote and 37 electoral votes. Per the 12th Amendment, he wasn't eligible in the contingent election since it could only involve the top 3 candidates. As the Speaker of the House at the time, Clay allegedly whipped up the votes he needed to give the election to Adams, a shock against Jackson, and Adams then picked Clay as his Secretary of State in what has since become known as the corrupt bargain. Still, Jackson ran a great campaign and a smart race. He just didn't have the political winds fully in his favor. Yet. Doing this allowed him to win in a landslide 4 years later and usher in Jacksonian democracy for a generation. And the number 1 best campaign ever by a losing presidential candidate? Gerald Ford, 1976. There was no way possible for Gerald Ford to win this election. Corruption, foreign policy failures, and a bad economy all plagued his run. Ford was the incumbent, accidental Republican president who rose to the office because Republican Richard Nixon had to resign due to Watergate in 1974, and that was after Ford had replaced Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, in 1973, since Agnew resigned over his own bribery scandal from his time as governor of Maryland. Having served as a congressman from Michigan for 24 years before that, Ford remains the only president to never be a part of a winning presidential ticket. All of this corruption was only made worse when Ford decided to pardon Nixon after his resignation. Ford's foreign policy was also wildly unpopular at the time, even if his decisions look better in hindsight. Most notably, the Helsinki Accords, which was an agreement signed by 35 nations including the United States and Soviet Union that he helped broker, was seen as capitulating to the USSR during the Cold War and recognizing their dominance over Eastern Europe. His pullout of Vietnam also generated political backlash, as the chaos in the war's final days that saw mass evacuation of US troops and South Vietnamese personnel in 1975, combined with the fall of Saigon to North Vietnam, was all on TV for everybody to see. Then there was a really bad recession from 1973 to 1975 that coincided with high inflation, marking the first major period of sustained stagflation in US history. Simply put, Ford literally had everything working against him, and was even further weakened by a bitter primary contest against Ronald Reagan in which he barely prevailed in 1976. All of this made the election of Democratic outsider and Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter to the White House in 1976 inevitable. However, this should have been a landslide for the Democrats, and it wasn't. Carter only won 297 electoral votes and only captured the popular vote by 2 percentage points. Ford was 18,000 votes in 2 states away from winning the Electoral College. How did he keep it so close? By brilliantly portraying himself in a presidential manner that made him look like the steady hand the country needed. Ford's strategy after the primary was to avoid too much direct campaigning and instead utilize the TV era to his advantage. His team called it the Rose Garden strategy. While Carter campaigned across the country making his case, Ford would give televised announcements from the White House, explaining to the public everything he was doing at the time. This actually helped restore public trust after Watergate, and Ford began to be seen as a man with honesty, reliability, and the necessary integrity to heal the country after such a scandal. Ford's strategy on this front dates back almost 2 years before the election, when in his State of the Union speech in January of 1975, he was honest.
And I must say to you that the State of the Union is not good.
Conventional wisdom is that this hurt him, but actually, if you look at the perception of Ford on election day, it more than likely began the process of the public seeing Ford as a candid man. Then there were the debates. Ford was the clear winner of the first debate by highlighting the improving economy in 1976 and successfully portraying himself as having guided the US away from the reckless spending policies of his former boss, Nixon, and Lyndon B. Johnson before that. Historians say Ford made a huge gaffe that cost him in the second debate when, in response to the Helsinki Accords, he seemed to dismiss the concerns of Eastern Europe.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
The argument is that this cost Ford with those of Eastern European descent in America, which is why Carter won states like Ohio and Wisconsin, the difference in the election. Any analysis beyond surface level, though, actually suggests that's not true. That comment was made in the context of supporting Eastern European countries, most notably Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia, and supporting the spirit of independence of those nations and its people. Conventional wisdom, though, is that Eastern European immigrants in America felt he wasn't sympathetic to the plight of their native countries. So who was right? When you look at the data, it's clear Carter won that group, to be fair. A 2010 book called Polish Americans Today, published with support from Polish diplomats in Chicago that tracks the support of voters of Polish descent, revealed Carter won 60% of that group in Chicago despite Nixon winning that group 4 years earlier. However, Nixon's win was in a landslide election. He won 61% of the popular vote overall and only 53% of the Polish American vote in Chicago. Meanwhile, Ford won 48% of the popular vote and 40% of the Polish American vote in Chicago. In fact, Ford had significantly outperformed typical Republicans with the Polish vote in Chicago dating back to the New Deal, which usually preferred Democrats by over 70%. Simply put, a full breakdown of the data would show that the gaffe didn't really have any impact on his standing within that community. Beyond the debates and the presidential portrayal, Ford's understanding of the growing role TV would play in politics also had a huge impact. By countering Carter's cross-country campaigning with the Rose Garden strategy, Ford wasn't spending a lot of money, but he was able to cut Carter's polling advantage from 35 points in July to 11 points at the end of September, because only Carter was going to be the one making the gaffe since he was on the campaign trail. Most notably when Carter did an interview with Playboy and said he's committed lust in his heart, unnecessarily undercutting his standing with evangelical voters at that time. That put Ford in comeback range, and by saving his money, he had a war chest of funds in the final month, all of which he used on a blitz of TV ads that everybody saw and Carter wasn't able to counter. These ads portrayed Ford as experienced and qualified for the job, and they highlighted Carter's lack of commitment to any specific economic policy, especially when it comes to taxes. The strategy almost worked, as Ford gained 10 points on Carter in the month of October alone. Unfortunately for him, the fundamentals of the election were just too much to overcome, but to keep this election close was nothing short of a miracle. Thanks for hopping into the History Buffs Hub to watch this video. Who would you say ran the best campaign among candidates who lost a presidential election? Please tell us in the comments, and once again, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more history videos in the future.